And so, a UK budget that goes back to the 70s. Rishi Sunak echoes Dennis Healey, with corporation tax going up to 25%, but not until 2023. The Chancellor says it's a budget for the pandemic and the recovery. Nicola Sturgeon dismisses a conspiracy against Alex Salmond as absurd. The First Minister admits she perhaps wrestled too long with loyalty to him. And Kate Forbes warns the storm clouds of austerity are on the horizon. From Caledonia Media, I'm Charles Fletcher with Scotland's favourite political show, The Week in Holyrood.
I have never claimed in this or anything else to be infallible. I have searched my soul on all of this many, many times over. It may very well be that I didn't get everything right, that's for others to judge. But in one of the most invidious political and personal situations I have ever faced, I believe I acted properly and appropriately, and that overall I made the best judgments I could.
Matanva, Fiskama. Previously, in Holyrood, former First Minister Alex Salmond claimed there was a conspiracy against him, setting out even to get him jailed. The current First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says that's a nonsense and absurd. In the latest session of evidence to the Holyrood Harassment Committee, Nicola Sturgeon says she worries the voices of the women who complained about Alex Salmond's alleged behaviour are being missed, and she wishes the committee had more time for them. Ms Sturgeon met Alex Salmond at her home in Glasgow on the 2nd of April 2018. She told the committee he showed her a letter that was so significant in its detail, she would live with that moment forever. Nicola Sturgeon crucially chose not to intervene. She denies this means she was out to get Alex Salmond.
Alex Salmond has been, and I've said this many times, one of the closest people to me in my entire life, and some people around this table know what I mean by that more than others might. I would never have wanted to get Alex Salmond, and I would never ever have wanted any of this to happen. If I could have, short of brushing complaints under the carpet, which would have been wrong to be, if I could turn the clock back and find legitimate ways that none of this would ever have happened, then I would. Alex Salmond has been for most of my life, since I was about 20, 21 years old, not just a very close political colleague, a friend, in my younger days, somebody I looked up to and revered. You know, I had no motive, intention, desire to get Alex Salmond.
She says she had no intention of trying to influence the complaints process, and Ms Sturgeon claims this forms the root of his anger towards her. There is indeed a sadness and trauma for Nicola Sturgeon of the collapse of a close friendship of many years. But Nicola Sturgeon does not believe it is reasonable to expect her to apologise for the behaviour of Alex Salmond.
I feel I must rebut the absurd suggestion that anyone acted with malice or as part of a plot against Alex Salmond. That claim is not based in any fact. What happened is this, and it is simple. A number of women made serious complaints about Alex Salmond's behaviour. The government, despite the mistake it undoubtedly made, tried to do the right thing. As First Minister, I refused to follow the age-old pattern of allowing a powerful man to use his status and connections to get what he wants. The police conducted an independent criminal investigation. The Crown Office, as it does in prosecutions every single day of the week, considered the evidence and decided there was a case to answer. A court and a jury did their jobs, and now this committee and an independent investigation are considering what happened and why. For my part, I am, if not relishing the prospect, relieved to be finally facing this committee. But given all that has brought us to this moment, being here also makes me really sad, and in all the legitimate consideration of this, sometimes the personal and human elements of this situation are lost. Alex spoke on Friday about what a nightmare the last couple of years have been for him, and I don't doubt that. I have thought often about the impact on him. He was someone I cared about for a long time. And maybe that's why on Friday I found myself searching for any sign at all that he recognised how difficult this has been for others too. First and foremost for women who believed his behaviour towards them was inappropriate, but also for those of us who have campaigned with him, worked with him, cared for him and considered him a friend, and who now stand unfairly accused of plotting against him. That he was acquitted by a jury of criminal conduct is beyond question, beyond question. But I know, just from what he told me, that his behaviour was not always appropriate. And yet, across 6 hours of testimony, there was not a single word of regret, reflection, or even simple acknowledgement of that. I can only hope that, in private, the reality might be different. Today, though, is about my actions. I have never claimed in this or anything else to be infallible. I have searched my soul on all of this many, many times over. It may very well be that I didn't get everything right. That's for others to judge. But in one of the most invidious political and personal situations I have ever faced, I believe I acted properly and appropriately, and that overall I made the best judgments I could. For anyone, at least anyone willing to listen with an open mind, that is what I will seek to demonstrate today.
Referring to Mr Salmon's evidence before the committee last week, the First Minister said as she watched him lashing out, she wondered if he ever reflects on the fact many, including her, feel very let down by him.
As I heard Alex's evidence on Friday, and I may be being unfair to him here, he seemed to be saying he didn't think there should have been a procedure in place that was capable of investigating him, because he didn't think that there should have been, or if there had been a procedure about allowed investigation of historic allegations, that should have taken 18 months or so to put in place. And that is what struck me in terms of that section of his evidence, that his view was it not just that the complaints against him shouldn't have been investigated, but that it should have been impossible to investigate them because there should have been no procedure that allowed it to happen. I fundamentally disagree with that, and I know the committee pursued this line of questioning and has with others. You know, this Parliament, in fact, I think it comes to stage 3 sometime over the next few days, is changing its procedures to allow historic complaints against MSPs to be investigated. Why did we decide to... well, firstly, in light of Me Too, we took a decision. The Cabinet took a decision on the 31st of October to review its procedures. It didn't take that decision with a preconceived notion of what the outcome of that review should be. We gave the civil service an open commission to review procedures. I think, given, and I know, you know, we're talking about this with the passage of some time, but given the profile of the Me Too revelations, given how much attention organisations the world over were doing this at that time, it would have been not just remiss of us not to do it. I'm pretty sure it would have attracted substantial criticism had we not done that. So that's the first point. And secondly, as that process started and as the gaps and weaknesses in current procedures were identified, the view was that a standalone process that allowed current or former ministers and allowed expressly historic allegations to be investigated was appropriate.
Thank you. I think Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, First Minister. Is the fact that civil servants in the Scottish Government have had concerns, may indeed currently continue to have concerns, something that you will now take more seriously in the aftermath of all of this?
Yes, but I hope it is the case that I have taken it seriously previously. I made a comment in my opening remarks about soul searching on this, and these are aspects that I have deeply thought about in the wake of this, and I want to try and briefly, because I know time is marching on. I did not know, so I now know there was an incident that Alex Salmond apologised to somebody for back in 2013. I did not know that at the time. I did not know I did not hear concerns about that back then. Part of me wishes I had. If there had been concerns, I'm not saying they would have been well-founded, but I didn't. If you ask me, and I think I referred to this briefly in my written submission, Alec, like many people can be, so I'm not particularly singling him out other than that this is the basis of the question. He was a tough guy to work for. He could be very challenging to work for. If Alec was displeased with you, he would make that pretty obvious. And there were times where I did challenge his behaviour in that respect, when I witnessed situations where I thought he had or was perhaps risking crossing a line. But one of the things I have thought about is whether those of us who had worked very closely with Alec for a long, long time had become a bit inured to that kind of behaviour. And I'm talking about that, not anything allegedly sexual. And whether we had a higher threshold for that than perhaps people in government in 2007 had. I am trying to respect the processes that are already underway into these things, this committee and the inquiry into the ministerial code. These are matters that are being considered by both of those, and I, rightly or wrongly, Mr. Fraser, and people can draw their own conclusions from that, but rightly and wrongly, I am trying to allow these processes to run their course. The police do not need my authority to investigate any matter that they wish to investigate.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says, unlike Alex Salmond, she never tries to make out she's always right, never infallible. And at times, through the early stages of all this, Nicola Sturgeon says she perhaps acted for too long out of loyalty to a friend and political partner of very many years.
I was dealing with a situation that involved somebody who was, the former First Minister facing a government investigation, the former leader of my party, where this potentially has had huge implications for my party, and somebody that was a really close friend of mine that I cared about. And all of these things led me to make these decisions and try to balance them overall in a way that I thought was appropriate. We've talked a lot about 29th of March and 2nd of April. I've set out the reasons why I decided to meet on the 7th of June. I think the 14th of July, you could actually say, why did I do that? And that's the one I've said, why did I do that? And, I think I know why I did it. I still had this worry that this might be about to erupt, and I was still concerned about him, and I felt, and I'm just going to say this, I still felt, despite everything, a loyalty to him, and that's why I made these decisions. And people will have to decide whether they think I was right or wrong, but I tried to, and the thing I was absolutely adamant about is that I would not, on his behalf, despite all I've just said about loyalty and friendship, I would not try to influence this process in the way he wanted me to, because I think that would have been inappropriate, and that is the touchstone on this, that I believe I was right to do. I know I've heard this afternoon different views on that, but I believe that was the right decision to make.
This was an extraordinary day in a parliament that has seen many incredible days. A First Minister under oath, taking questions and giving evidence for more than 8 hours. At times irritated by repetition from the committee, at times displaying her sense of humour, and at times there was a crack in her voice, a turn in her face, as she perhaps reflected on times gone. The committee's report is expected to be published before the election in May. You're listening to The Week in Holyrood. I'm Charles Fletcher. The First Minister says we may step out of lockdown earlier than expected as the number of coronavirus cases continues to fall. Nicola Sturgeon says there's good evidence Scotland's vaccination programme is already helping to reduce the number of deaths from COVID.
Children in primaries 1 to 3 are of course already back at school full time. We continue to monitor the impacts of that, although it is too early to be certain. And some secondary school students have also returned to take part in essential practical work for national qualifications. And childcare and early education premises are also now open for children below school age. The next phase of reopening education will take place on March the 15th, and I can confirm today that from that date, 15th March, unless new evidence or new circumstances force us to reconsider, which we of course hope will not be the case, all children in primary 4 to 7 will go back to school on a full-time basis. All primary school children will also be able to return to regulated childcare, including after-school and breakfast clubs. We'll also take the next steps in a phased return to secondary school from 15th March with a clear expectation that all school pupils, all secondary school pupils will be back in school on a full-time basis following the Easter holidays. However, it is the intention that all secondary school pupils will return to spend some time in school from 15th March until the Easter break. Students in the senior phase of secondary school, that's of course years 4 to 6, who are taking national qualifications will have priority for face-to-face lessons in school. This will ensure that they can have their hard work fairly recognised with qualifications under the alternative certification model. However, although years 4 to 6 may have priority, we expect that all children in secondary school will receive some in-school education each week up until the Easter break and then return full-time following that. This will allow pupils to get used to being back in school and allow them to start seeing friends again. And I'm sure everyone will agree that this is important for the well-being of young people as well as for education. Before Easter, of course, since this will be a blended learning model, we will also continue to ensure that remote learning is of the highest standard possible. Reports from Her Majesty's Inspector of Education have shown that the delivery of remote learning has improved greatly between the first and second lockdowns, and I'm immensely grateful to all of the teachers and other education professionals who have done so much to build on the experience of the first lockdown. We'll work with Education Scotland to ensure that enhanced online resources continue to be available over the coming month, and we will work with local authorities to support young people's well-being in other ways, for example by providing more opportunities for outdoor learning. Education Scotland will publish guidance for local authorities on the phased return over the next few days, and local authorities will have flexibility in how they implement the phased return to allow them to take account of local factors in deciding how to make the return as safe as possible. But we want to ensure that they are able to maximise the number of time that secondary school pupils can safely spend in school in the period up to the Easter holidays. Obviously, we recognise that the safety of staff and children must continue to be a key priority. All local authorities, therefore, will, at least until the Easter break, and indeed this is one of the limitations, continue to observe the current requirement for 2-metre physical distancing in secondary schools. And when secondary schools return, face coverings will need to be worn at all times. The Advisory Group on Education and Children's Issues has also noted the continuing importance of good ventilation. We provided local authorities with £375 million of education recovery funding to date, and many councils are using some of this funding to monitor and improve ventilation in schools. In addition, we will continue to offer twice-weekly lateral flow testing for all school staff in primary, secondary and special schools and all secondary school pupils in years 4, 5 and 6. And I would encourage as many staff and senior phase pupils as possible to use the tests when they return. It's a further important way to ensure that schools remain as safe as possible. The final point I want to make on schools is simply to say thank you, firstly, to all school leadership teams and all school staff, including, of course, all teachers, for everything that has been done to support children and young people in the last few months. I know everyone is looking forward to having children back in the classroom as soon as possible. I also want to thank parents across the country. I can only imagine how difficult all of this disruption continues to be, but I hope and I believe that the end of it is now firmly in sight. And my thanks too to children and young people. I know how hard it must be to be separated from friends and teachers, but you have all responded magnificently to all of the difficulties of the past year, and I hope you're looking forward to getting back to school later this month. And I hope that you will also start to feel life become a lot more normal very soon. The phased approach we're taking to school return can and will be frustrating, I know that, but it is necessary and it is firmly based on the expert advice that we've received. It is the best and also the most sustainable and enduring way to get as many children back to school as possible, as safely as possible. Now, there's one other issue I want to briefly highlight today. I can confirm that we are clarifying guidance on an issue that is directly relevant to parents of newborn children. There are currently a number of essential purposes, for example, essential care, which enable us to go into someone else's house right now. We are amending guidance on this today to make it clear that those essential purposes include support for the welfare and well-being of a parent of a child under the age of 1. And I hope that gives clarity and enables vital support for parents of very young children. Presiding Officer, as we come out of this lockdown, hopefully the last lockdown, we are prioritising, as we said we would, the education and well-being of our children. In addition, although we remain cautious, as we have to be in the face of a dangerous and highly infectious virus, I hope that people will take heart from the data I have reported. It shows real, significant and sustained progress in getting the virus back under control. Next week, I hope to confirm to Parliament the other changes to the Level 4 restrictions that will take effect from the 15th March. And then the week after that, I'm scheduled to set out a firmer timetable for the period after 26 April. As I said at the outset, indeed as I said last week, we will consider between now and then if the data allows us to bring forward any relaxation of the rules. I've always said if we can go further and faster, then we will not hesitate to do so. All of us want to move on as quickly as possible and as a priority to see friends and family again, and that will very much be the focus of our considerations over the next week. And I hope the day for that is now not too far away.
Conservative Group Leader at Holyrood, Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the news this week that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine can reduce hospital admissions by 80% after one dose is welcome indeed. The fact that infection rates, hospitalisation rates and fatalities are all down significantly should be of huge reassurance to us all. This week was also a week of milestones, with more than 20 million people across the UK and 1.5 million across Scotland receiving their first vaccination. Vaccinations, of course, don't just help those receiving the jab, they help us all. And with just over a quarter of adults in Edinburgh now having been vaccinated, up to nearly half in Dumfries and Galloway, the trend is clear. The greater the rollout, the greater reduction in case numbers and the severity of cases. So it is right that the Scottish Government reconsiders its reopening plan for the country with respect to the improved results that we are seeing. And I welcome that Scottish Conservative calls for an earlier return to school for many pupils have been listened to. And while it is hugely welcome to young people's mental health and well-being, their social development and their educational attainment, getting all pupils to return while still observing COVID rules does pose some logistical questions. Face coverings and social distancing are now concepts we take for granted in so many areas of our lives, but teachers and head teachers are rightly asking what support they will receive if their school estate doesn't allow for the 2-metre social distancing in classroom that the government requires of secondary schools. If you can't fit all pupils into their usual classroom with the 2-metre rule, and if you have no extra classrooms or staff to man the split or composite classes created, what support and solutions are going to be made available for them?
First Minister.
Well, all of the developments that I narrated earlier on and have just been reiterated are really welcome. I don't want to overstate this because I don't think it's fair to people. I've tried not to give people false promises on this, but I do think we have every reason now to believe that the exit from lockdown might be quicker and come sooner than we believed would be the case just a few weeks ago. But we know that the worst thing we could do, and what would make that less likely, is if we move too quickly right now and jeopardise the situation that is now beginning to emerge in such a positive way. So that's why we need to be careful, and that caution, as well as a determination to get children back to normal, lies behind the decisions that I've outlined today on schools. We continue to work with schools to make sure that while it is not possible to have all young people back to school as normal, there is a good provision of remote learning for the period between now and Easter. Then there will be a blended learning approach for secondary schools, and we continue to work with schools and local authorities to make sure that that is of the quality that young people and their parents expect. We've given local authorities significant funding to help with practical arrangements in schools. I mentioned ventilation in my opening remarks, but that will cover a range of other things. But key to this, as it was last August when we managed to support the full-time return of school for all pupils and keep schools open virtually for the remainder of last year. The key is to get the virus as low as possible so that as much normality in schools becomes possible and some of the restrictions can be eased, which allows that normality to open up. The additional factor we have now, which we didn't have last August, of course, is what we hope will be the suppressive effect of the vaccine. So these are things we monitor on an ongoing basis, take advice and work with local authorities and schools to facilitate. But I hope that by the time we are coming out of the Easter break, we have further progress that allows much greater normality in our schools than has been possible up until now.
Asking his first question in the Chamber as leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, Anas Sarwar.
Can I thank the FM for advance sight of our statement, and can I extend my condolences to all those who have lost loved ones. This has been a difficult year for us all, and our thoughts and condolences go out to all those that have lost a loved one. As the First Minister said, it is 12 months since the first COVID-19 case was identified in Scotland, and in that time we have seen our frontline workers, our NHS staff, our social care staff and all our frontline workers continue to go above and beyond, and our heartfelt thanks to every single one of them and their families. The vaccine rollout is the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's great to see the evidence of its efficacy, giving us all hope. But as lockdown restrictions begin to lift, I do urge the Scottish Government to also focus on our recovery, and I will support all efforts by the Government to bring our communities together and to rebuild our nation. That must be our collective priority for everyone across this Parliament. Presiding Officer, parents across the country are worried about their child's education and their child's mental health. Can the First Minister therefore confirm when our Government will set out details of a national recovery plan for Scotland's pupils and our education system? Figures published today on child and adolescent mental health services show that more than 1,500 children are on waiting lists already waited more than a year to be seen by a specialist. More than 1,500 children. And the last quarter, 25%, 1 in 4 children, had their referral rejected. What more can the Scottish Government do to give support to children who need it right now, particularly in crisis services? And finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has a target of 400,000 vaccinations a week, a target that I have welcomed and that I support. But the numbers from the last week in February show an average of around 29,000 vaccinations per day, and yesterday fewer than 23,000 people were vaccinated. And today the First Minister has suggested that already there's a potential of slowing vaccination rates going forward even further. When will we have that target met of 400,000 vaccinations a week so we can collectively get out of this crisis?
First Minister.
On the questions he has asked me, in terms of a national recovery plan for education, the work to support recovery in education is already underway. The funding I've set out, the steps that we are supporting with local authorities, so provision, for example, of tutoring support through eSchool, the money we've made available for additional teachers, the extra funding for local authorities that they can use flexibly based on what they consider is the most appropriate way, and we will keep that under review. I have said, Deputy First Minister has said, supporting children to come through and to catch up, not just educationally but in a whole range of ways from the experience of the last year, will be a long-term project. Similarly, on mental health, we've already published a mental health recovery plan. The Mental Health Minister will continue to keep Parliament updated. Before the pandemic, transforming and redesigning the provision of child and adolescent mental health services was a priority. So one of the things we had already made real progress on was mental health counsellors available for all secondary schools. That work needs to pick up and be intensified as a result of the experience of the pandemic. Finally, on vaccination, we exceeded the 400,000 a week when we had the supplies to do it. So the constraining factor right now, which is not within our control, is supply. The dip in daily vaccination rates in the last couple of weeks, which we flagged in advance, was entirely down to supply. If you look at numbers across the 4 nations, you will see that same dip. We expect that there might be another dip in supply next week. We don't expect that to affect the mid-April targets. But we're in a position now, I'm not complacent about this, it takes a lot of work by a lot of people across the entire country. We're in a position now to be able to go as fast as we have supplies to vaccinate people. The constraining factor is the supplies, and that is why we continue to talk regularly to the pharmaceutical companies to get as long-term a line of sight on their manufacturing and supply prospects as we can. But we'll vaccinate people just as fast as we have the vaccine to do it.
There will be a further review of easing Level 4 lockdown restrictions next week. You're listening to The Week in Holyrood. I'm Charles Fletcher. Coming up in the next half hour, questions to the First Minister.
The government could have passed it to their lawyers in September or October or November, but they withheld it. They kept it secret, and it cost them months and all of us £500,000 of taxpayers' money.
Can I gently point out to Ruth Davidson that this democratic institution that she extols the virtues of is the same democratic institution that she is about to depart to take up a seat in the unelected House of Lords.
Presiding Officer, the exchanges we have just heard represent the worst of our politics.
I sat before that committee, I answered every question, and I will give the committee and the inquiry the opportunity now to do their work.
Those who worked for decades to establish the Scottish Parliament did not do so for this to be flouted by a belligerent and secretive 14-year-old government more interested in defending itself than aiding the process of democracy.
And there's an extra £1.2 billion for Scotland in the Westminster budget. Now, as you heard a few moments ago, Glasgow MSP Anas Sarwar has won the leadership of the Labour Party in Scotland. It comes 9 weeks ahead of the Scottish parliamentary election. He's vowing to take on the SNP to win back lost Labour voters, and he accuses the Tories of chest-beating unionism. Mr Sarwar is the 10th Labour leader since the Parliament returned to Scotland in 1999. He's the first Muslim leader of a political party in the UK. On his first day in the chamber as leader, earlier this week, Nicola Sturgeon and Ruth Davidson both stepped up the banter as they congratulated him on his election.
May I also take this first parliamentary opportunity to welcome Anas Sarwar to his new role as Labour leader. It's the 5th time I've been able to do that in my time here, but I truly wish him well, and I extend all offices to work together constructively when it's in Scotland's interest to do so in the weeks ahead, even if it is only weeks that I have.
Thank you. Question 2 from Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank Ruth Davidson for her very kind comments, and I look forward in a matter of weeks to welcoming my second Conservative leader perhaps in my third Conservative leader in my short spell as Labour leader.
First Minister.
Well, can I also take the opportunity to welcome Anas Sarwar to his place? I don't want to brag here, and I'd have to count, but I think I'm probably well above 5 when it comes to Labour leaders that I've faced across this chamber. Can I say, in all seriousness, there is also a historic nature to Anas Sarwar's election as leader of the Scottish Labour Party, and I think it speaks well of the diversity of our country. So for that reason, if for no other reason, I wish him well in the job. It also proves one other thing, because Anas and I will not just face off across the chamber as respective leaders of our parties. Of course, we are opponents in the constituency of Glasgow Southside. So I think we've just proven again over the last few days that Glasgow Southside is actually the centre of the universe, which I know everybody in the chamber will agree with as much as Anas and I do. But I wish him... I was going to say I wish him all the best. I wish him a modicum degree of success in the weeks ahead.
Well, shortly after that, Anas Sarwar joined me here on The Week in Holyrood. Anas Sarwar, congratulations on becoming the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland. Now, as you well know, most leaders aim to achieve in their first 100 days. But it rather seems you've been out to achieve in your first 100 hours. Let's take a look at this. Launching Labour's Inclusive Campaign Cabinet, meeting Labour MPs at Westminster, provoking headlines suggesting you could cost the SNP its apparent majority at the upcoming election, launching the Scottish Labour Business Network led by Brian Wilson. Just a quiet day at the office for you.
Well, I'm glad we're coming into this with energy and enthusiasm and hitting the ground running. But the first and most important message is right at the start of my leadership was to speak directly to the people of Scotland and to recognise that at a time of rising inequality, injustice and division, I'm sorry they've not had the Labour Party they deserve, and I'm going to work day and night to change that. And you've given some of the examples that we've been busy doing in the first 48 hours or so. We're going to have the same level of energy, I hope, all the way to the election and beyond, because I think our politics does need to change the way our world has changed through COVID. And I want to be a leader that focuses on what unites our country, not what divides our country.
Does this mean Labour is back on the pitch of Scottish politics?
Labour's been off the pitch, and I'm not going to pretend it's an overnight job to solve all our problems and get us back to where we need to be. But we're certainly back on the pitch. We are playing the game again. We're ready to fight on behalf of the people that I believe need a functioning, active Labour Party again. And so, yes, you're going to see the same level of energy as we go forward. What's important to say is, look, this is not just about overarching messages. It's also about what we want to do and inspire across the country as well. And I've already said that in the coming days and weeks, we'll be setting out our vision for a more equal, fairer Scotland that does focus on healing our wounds, that does focus on reuniting our people and rebuilding our country. And at the heart of that is an education catch-up programme, because I know, speaking to other parents, how worried they are about their child's education and mental health. It is about having an NHS recovery plan, because there are still too many people that have had a cancelled operation in the last year or worried about their cancer diagnosis. And it's also about making sure we have an economic recovery programme, because people are worried about if and when they'll be able to return back to work. These are big issues and big challenges that I want us to grapple and confront.
You do seem to be capturing a buzz and an energy, but I'd like to know what your tactics are going to be for reconnecting with people across Scotland's communities, directly into communities.
It's going to be a different kind of election, Charles, obviously, with it being a COVID election. It's going to be largely a digital election rather than a conventional election campaign. But we're going to focus on what people's priorities are. I've said that already, and I'll say that again. And that's why I want to say to people, we don't need to go back to the old arguments. We don't need to come through COVID, the collective trauma of COVID, and go back into the binary choices that politicians have tried to present us with before and force us to pick a side. Instead, I think true leadership right now is to seek to pull our country together. And that's what I want to do, and work with anyone and everyone to rebuild the country we love.
You've spoken in the Chamber at Westminster in the House of Commons. You've spoken many times in the Chamber here at Holyrood. But I'm interested, this was your first appearance on Tuesday as leader of the party. How did that feel? How did it feel to be the leader speaking in the Parliament? It
was a bit of a strange feeling. Obviously, there was a bit of banter between the First Minister, Ruth Davidson, and I, which is all welcome. It's important, particularly in these difficult times, to have the ability to smile, to sometimes laugh, and to have fun at each other's expense, but also recognise the seriousness of the issues we're discussing. Perhaps a bit more chaotic than I would like, in terms of obviously just hitting the ground running, but I'm sure we'll get more organised as we go forward.
The former Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who supported Mr Sarwar's campaign, says there needs to be clarity on the future shape of the UK. He tells ITV News there has to be a greater understanding of the case for independence, as well as that for the Union.
You've got to look at it this way. Do you want independence or not? Do you want to break away from the United Kingdom, or do you want to cooperate? And I think it comes down to that central question. Now, you could, of course, have a referendum. The question is, should you have a referendum at a time when there's needing a time to heal from the virus and the recession? And we also need a time to reflect. We don't have the facts before us yet. We don't know what independence means for jobs, for trade, for security, for defence, for the welfare state, for our pensions. Nobody has given us these up-to-date facts, and nobody has given us the facts about what it means to stay in the Union under the internal market bill of Boris Johnson. So let's get the facts on the table, let everybody see what's actually happening, and that's the only way in which a democracy can approach looking at these issues.
And a new poll is showing momentum continuing to favour Scottish independence. The Savanta Comres poll shows 53% of those asked saying they would vote yes in an independence referendum if it was held tomorrow. The poll also reveals that 71% of Scots believe Scotland would fare better as an independent country. Now, just before we go into the chamber for questions to the First Minister, tariffs on UK goods imposed by Donald Trump have been suspended for 4 months with immediate effect. The agreement is designed to help reach a permanent end to 25% tariffs on Scotch whisky and cashmere from the United States. Into the chamber then, and we begin with Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to ask the First Minister about the legal advice on the Salmond inquiry, because despite this Parliament voting for it to be released 4 months ago, it was only partially revealed this week. The Ministerial Code makes clear in section 2.30 that ministers must act lawfully, informed of the legal considerations, and that the legal implications of any course of action are considered at the earliest opportunity. And this part, acting early on legal implications, is important. So let's go through the timeline. 9 weeks before conceding the judicial review, legal advice stated that the case was more likely to fail than succeed. The First Minister chose to go forward. A month before conceding, legal advice said the least worst option was to stop because otherwise, and I quote, expenses will be far higher. The First Minister chose the worst option. 19 days before conceding, the Lord Advocate, government and external lawyers all said the case was not even stateable, the minimum requirement. The First Minister dug her heels in. So will she tell us, to quote the words of her own legal counsel, why did the government try to defend the indefensible for so long?
First Minister.
Well, I think as anybody who paid any attention to lengthy proceedings yesterday, which clearly didn't include Ruth Davidson, will have seen that's just simply not true. On December the 11th, the law officers were very clear, and the information on this has been published, and I think the quote from the law officer summarised in the note that was published in advance of yesterday was that there was no question that the case should be dropped. On the contrary, there were credible arguments to be made across the petition, including on the issue of the appointment of the investigating officer. So that was the position of the law officers. Things started to go wrong, seriously wrong in the case in the days that followed, and then due process was followed that led to a decision on the part of the government to concede the case. So that is there for anybody with an open mind to look at. I think the Deputy First Minister has undertaken to provide some further information to the committee, which will happen, and the Parliament can look at that. I answered questions for 8 hours on this yesterday. I answered every question that was put to me, and so, Presiding Officer, I intend now to rest on that, to allow both the committee and the inquiry on the Ministerial Code to conclude their work. In the meantime, I'm going to get on with the job I suspect most people watching at home right now want me to get on with, which is leading this country through and out of a pandemic. And I'll leave Ruth Davidson and the Conservatives to play the political games that they seem to prioritise over everything else.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister characterised this as political games, but I have never forgotten the women who were failed at the heart of this inquiry. And the thing that the First Minister cannot get away from is that it was her government that failed them, and that questions still require to be answered. And First Minister, it's not up for question if the government ignored legal advice and cost taxpayers' money. What's being argued is how long and how much was wasted. And this is what's truly incredible. The view of legal counsel was, and I quote, based on the facts as then known. And First Minister, this government didn't even give its own lawyers the facts. Advocates Roddy Dunlop and Christine O'Neill stated this: "We have each experienced extreme professional embarrassment. On instruction, they made plainly and demonstrably untrue statements before a judge. Documents were withheld from those QCs, which were highly relevant yet undisclosed. They called that unexplained and frankly inexplicable. They refused to, and I quote, rehearse the regrettable way in which the document disclosure has unfolded." So I'll ask the First Minister to rehearse it for us now. Will she confirm that the withheld documents were precisely the ones that made this case unstateable?
First Minister.
Firstly, I'm going to agree with something that Ruth Davidson said. I agree that she has not forgotten the women at the heart of this, because I don't think Ruth Davidson ever remembered the women at the heart of this. The legal advice is there for everyone to see, and people with an open mind, which doesn't include Ruth Davidson, can look at that. Now, Ruth Davidson says that she's not playing political games. I beg to differ. I think we saw the true colours of the Conservatives yesterday. First of all, on Tuesday night, they said this. I don't know if Ruth Davidson approved this comment or not, but the Conservatives said in terms that it did not matter what I said before a parliamentary committee yesterday because they had already made up their minds. It's not about due process, it's political desperation on the part of the Conservatives. But, Presiding Officer, I think we also had a glimpse of some of the values at play with the Conservatives yesterday, because during that committee session, one of the Tory members on it seemed to be suggesting that I should have intervened in the process to effectively sweep the allegations against Mr Salmond under the carpet. And then the other Conservative member asks me to apologise for the inappropriate behaviour of a man. So there we have the Tories, I think, demonstrating without any help from me that they are indeed playing political games. So while they do that, I say again, 8 hours of evidence to a committee. It's time to allow the committee and the independent inquiry into the ministerial code to do their job. And in the meantime, I'm going to go on with my job of leading this country through COVID and out of lockdown.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer.
Order, please.
But the First Minister can't get away from the fact that this chamber is an organ of this Parliament, and this chamber only saw the legal advice that this chamber voted for 4 months ago this week. And we have every right to question a First Minister who is the head of a government who failed these 2 women. And First Minister, I want everyone to understand how incompetent and secretive this government is. Legal counsel was provided with 1 email in a chain. It was a crucial element to their defence. But they were not given the next email, sent less than half an hour later, in the same chain. It was withheld, and when it was finally handed over, it was one of the final straws, and her lawyers had to threaten to resign to force the government's hand. Presiding Officer, that information was available the whole time. The government could have passed it to their lawyers in September or October or November, but they withheld it. They kept it secret, and it cost them months and all of us £500,000 of taxpayers' money. First Minister, why was the crucial evidence withheld for months from the government's own legal team?
First Minister.
The case ultimately collapsed because information came to light. I set that out in the committee yesterday, and people can judge by looking at the advice that was published themselves. And of course the committee will come to its conclusions, as will the independent inquiry on the ministerial code, and I await the findings of both. But again, if I can try to strike a note of consensus, because I do believe in the importance of this democratic institution. By the time I sit down after this session of First Minister's questions today, I will have been subjected, rightly and properly, to 10 hours of parliamentary scrutiny over the course of this week. That's me doing my job in discharging my responsibilities. But can I gently point out to Ruth Davidson that this democratic institution that she extols the virtues of is the same democratic institution that she is about to depart to take up a seat in the unelected House of Lords. I think people across this country are becoming heartily sick of the soon-to-be Baroness Davidson lecturing anybody else on democracy.
With his first session of FMQs, Labour leader Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, the exchanges we have just heard represent the worst of our politics. Each day, each and every single one of us come into this chamber and we sit in front of that mace inscribed with the ideals of this Parliament: wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity. Principles that have been undermined when the government failed the women who submitted claims of harassment. Undermined by the government's refusal to hand over all documentation to the committee investigating these failures, and undermined by the government ignoring 2 votes of this Parliament calling for all the legal advice to be published. The government keeps telling us they have nothing to hide, but when this Parliament twice demanded legal advice be published, they refused. And when it was finally released, it was partial and came just hours before the First Minister's appearance. Wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity. First Minister, why did it take the threat of a no-confidence vote in the Deputy First Minister for your government to act?
First Minister.
Well, the importance for all governments of being able to take proper legal advice, I think, should be understood by everybody across this chamber. And the government, rightly now, given the allegations that have been levelled at it, have published that legal advice, and people can now look at that legal advice and draw their own conclusions. Now, I say again, I sat in front of a parliamentary committee. I'm not sure if there is any other member of this chamber has done likewise ever. I've sat in front of a parliamentary committee for 8 hours, as is my duty and obligation, answered questions that were put to me and put the case of the government. I also apologised, as I will do again, to the women who were let down by the mistake that the government made. So I think it is now right and proper, and I think it is in line with the principles on that mace, which I, like all of us, hold dear, is that we allow the inquiry to do its work. We allow the independent inquiry into the ministerial code to do its work, and we allow me to get on with the job I believe the majority of the country want me to focus on now, which is to continue to steer this country through a global pandemic so that we can get through COVID, come out of lockdown and get back to normality. And that is what I intend to focus on while these inquiries conclude their work.
Anna Sarwar.
First Minister, that answer would have more credibility if all of the legal advice was published before you gave evidence, not legal advice after you give evidence. Now, the First Minister has rightly had the opportunity to address the committee yesterday, and I do agree with her. It is important that all parties are given due process and that we do not prejudice the outcome of the inquiry. With that in mind, within the coming weeks, James Hamilton QC will present his report on potential breaches of the ministerial code to the government. The outcome of this report will be crucial in establishing the facts about what happened. The wholly unacceptable and disgraceful situation we have had with the legal advice cannot be repeated with the Hamilton report. So can the First Minister give the people of Scotland a cast-iron guarantee that the government will release the report without delay or obstruction on the day it is handed over by James Hamilton QC?
First Minister.
Yes.
I welcome that commitment from the First Minister, but remember this, we will hold her to that promise, because the First Minister is right. This is about transparency, and there can be no delay in publishing this report. The ministerial code exists to uphold standards in public life. It is there to protect the integrity of the office of the First Minister, of all Scottish ministers and the whole of the Scottish Government. In her foreword to the ministerial code, the First Minister says, and I quote, "I will lead by example in following the letter and spirit of this code, and I expect all ministers and civil servants to do likewise." Wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity. In that light, does the First Minister agree, removing party and personality, that a minister, any minister who is found in breach of the ministerial code should resign?
First Minister.
I will uphold my words in the foreword to the ministerial code. I will uphold the principles on that mace, but I will also demand the right to due process, which one party at least is not prepared to give me. So let's wait and see what the outcome of the inquiries are. They will be published, and then we can debate in this chamber the outcome of that. I sat before that committee, I answered every question, and I will give the committee and the inquiry the opportunity now to do their work.
For the Lib Dems, Willie Rennie.
There may have been 8 hours of questioning yesterday, but there are still areas of outstanding concern. Forgetting about a meeting, having a different recollection of another meeting, keeping meetings from the Permanent Secretary and not acting swiftly on a claimed leak of a complainer's name. But the First Minister is right that this is a matter for the committee and for the independent investigator to untangle these matters. But there is one lesson that we should all be able to learn today. It should not take the threat to the job of the Deputy First Minister, before the Government complies with the will of this Parliament to release the legal advice it voted for months ago. Those who worked for decades to establish the Scottish Parliament did not do so for this to be flouted by a belligerent and secretive 14-year-old government more interested in defending itself than aiding the process of democracy. Why can't she see that that needs to change?
First Minister.
In some ways, I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree to disagree with Willie Rennie. After the parliamentary votes, the Deputy First Minister had a process of discussion with the committee, which actually led to the committee having access to summaries of the legal advice that the government had had, and earlier this week that advice was published.
Now, the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak has announced an extra £1.2 billion for Scotland in his second budget. The furlough scheme has been extended and there's more support for the self-employed. But he goes back to the 70s and echoes Dennis Healey with plans to increase corporation tax. It'll go up to 25% in 2023. Scotland's Finance Secretary Kate Forbes says she welcomes extra spend, but she's disappointed with the budget overall. She's committed to a full year of 100% rates relief for retail, hospitality, leisure, aviation and newspaper businesses too. Kate Forbes warns the UK budget signals the storm clouds of austerity on the horizon. We go to the polls on Thursday, the 6th of May. The Scottish parliamentary election for the 6th session of Holyrood will go ahead as scheduled, but the count may be spread over several days, taking the result into the weekend. There will be a different approach to canvassing, with much of the door chapping changed to a digital nudge. If you want to apply for a postal vote, contact your local electoral registration office. Finally, we had an extraordinary day of testimony at the Scottish Parliament.